Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for attending our livestock deworming workshop tonight. So we'll get started. I'll introduce myself in Navajo first. Yat a Fecal Egg Counts Toho Gleaning Nishland Do Twada Chitney Bushes Chin Say Naha Bithli Dushes Chedo Tupahan Dashnele. Thank you everyone for attending. My name is Fecal Lantana. I am the field specialist for the Navajo Sustainable Agriculture Project. What we have here tonight is livestock deworming presentation workshop presented by Dr. John Wenzel. He's the extension veterinarian from New Mexico State University. So before we go ahead and turn it over, I'll go ahead and introduce to you our project. If I can push it, there it goes. Okay. So Navajo delivered in collaboration with two of our project partners. One is the Net College Land Grant Office and COPE, which stands for the Community Outreach and Patient Empowerment. Our project is funded by USDA Outreach and Assistance for Socially Disadvantaged Farmers and Ranchers and Veteran Farmers and Ranchers Program. In short, we call that OASD VFR. So it's pretty much a mouthful. So we'll go ahead and go on to the next slide and introduce to you what our goals and objectives is as a project. So our goals as NSA project is to help improve and sustain Native ranchers operations, Native agriculture operations, excuse me, by providing increased knowledge in USDA programs. So when I say USDA programs, it means various programs under the United States Department of Agriculture. That will be NRCS, FSA, RD, and RMA. And what those stands for is NRCS is Natural Resource Conservation Services. And we have FSA here, which stands for Farm Service Agency, RD's Rural Development, and RMA stands for Risk Management Agency programs. So we do want our Native farmers and ranchers to become aware of these programs and some opportunities that can help coincide with their operations. And we do provide technical services such as helping out with conservation plan workshops and other resource providers. We also want to help increase in local production and consumption of fruits and vegetables and provide healthy food for our Native families and individuals. So with that being said, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dr. John Wenzel, who's going to be taking over the livestock presentation workshop.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the invitation this evening. And it's like I told Fecal earlier, I'd a whole lot rather be there in person than on this computer, but we just got to do the best we can. So just to kind of go over just a little bit what I want to try to do this evening, I'm going to talk a little bit about just some very, very basic parasitology stuff, so that hopefully you'll get an understanding a little bit about why we do what we do when we get ready to deworm livestock, and realizing that there is becoming a much more significant problem with resistance by parasites to the dewormers that we use. And so it is important that we strategically deworm, and also the products that we need to use and that type of thing. We'll go over that. And then I'm going to just touch on some basic timing, which is really important, and just some suggestions that I have for deworming horses, cattle, sheep, and goats. And so that's what we're going to try to get with today. And what I'm hoping for is to leave a fair amount of time at the end of the presentation. And I would really like for you to ask questions. Now, I'm really good with, and Fecal can help us with that, but if somebody asks a question during the thing, I would rather answer it at that time as we're talking about it. So if you get some questions, let Fecal know in the chat room or whatever we got to do, but I'd rather answer questions as we go through as well. So don't worry. If you have a question, interrupt me and ask it. Let's just see if we can't get it done. But you can either, I don't know how it works, but either if you can interrupt me. If not, let Fecal know in the chat room that you've got a question and we'll try to get them answered. I want to start with this slide because I think it's really interesting. If you can see it, I don't know what you can see, but Anyway, there was a question about why do you deworm cattle? And this was in a survey where they were talking about stocker cattle. And you can see there the responses. There were 5 answers that they could pick from. Why do you deworm? And if you look at them, number 2 there, improved weight gains is by far the biggest response. But second was an improved immune system function. And so when you look at those 2 things, what does that mean? That means what you're trying to do is worm and do things that will help you from an economic standpoint. Basically, get a return on your investment that you pay for when you buy a deworming product. That's really what the most common outcome or most common desire is to make some money on doing something like this. But there's a lot of great things that happen, which we're going to talk a little bit about. When you do deworm, there's a lot of benefits that you may not see, but they are underlying, and they will help you from a bottom line standpoint, but some of it you can't see. So that's what we're going to try to talk about. You got to remember that there's only one source of parasites out there in the country, and that's your pasture. That's it. And you look at that country right there. I mean, that's pretty familiar to us for the folks that ranch in the Southwest. We got pastures that look like that. Well, and so there's always been a big major question that people ask me, well, how can there be worms out there if there's no grass? Well, you got to remember that there's been livestock on these grounds for centuries. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that eggs that were passed centuries ago are hatching, but what it does mean is that this country is inundated with parasites. And so cattle or sheep or goats or horses, whatever is grazing, there is always parasites that come out of the ground. Timing of that is important, and we'll talk about that. But even in our arid conditions, all of our pasture is contaminated to at least some degree. So we don't generally see real heavy parasitism that results in clinical signs. We see it occasionally. But for the most part, almost all of ours are subclinical. So there's different types of parasites that we're going to discuss. We're going to talk about those that are inside and those that are outside. So when we talk about internal parasites, the ones that we're most concerned about are the stomach worms and the intestinal worms, because they're the most common, and they're also ones that do the most damage for us. And so in the GI tract of cattle, there is a lot of infection that takes place. And if we look at our cattle anytime, basically we would find parasites in them. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever done fecal testing or fecal egg counts or something like that to look at it. And I have brought in people from the Midwest and had them help with some of these things, and they don't understand how worms work out here. And so they would do some fecal egg counts and not see any, and they said, oh, you don't have worms in your country. Well, they only reproduce at certain times when the conditions are right. And so you can do fecal egg counts, and you can check them for eggs in the manure. And a lot of times you won't see it because the conditions are such that the parasites are sitting either dormant or encysted, and they're not reproducing. Therefore, there will be no eggs in the manure. So what ends up happening is once they do start reproducing, these cattle will pass eggs into the manure that goes out on the ground, and they'll hatch. And then when it's raining, it'll wash the larvae out of the manure, and they migrate into the soil. And so then what happens is they sit there and wait until conditions are right for them, and then they will migrate up grass as it's growing. And I should have put a picture in. I've got a picture that shows a whole bunch of parasite larvae in a drop of water hanging from a blade of grass. But that's what happens. So when these cattle or sheep or goats or whatever it is come through there and they start to graze that, they will pick up a fair number of parasite larvae, which can turn into an infestation. So it's really what the pasture is doing matters a great deal. So it takes about 3 to 4 weeks or so for the worms to mature and begin reproducing inside the intestinal tract, and then they start laying eggs. So it depends on which worms we're talking about. There's lots of different species of them, but the most common and the one that causes the most damage is the brown stomach worm. And so what they do is in June, July, and August, it kind of sits dormant inside the stomach lining. It burrows in and it just sits there. And then once soil temperatures and moisture content reaches an optimal state, then they come out of that dormant state, and they erupt into the stomach and go down through the intestinal tract, where obviously they create a lot of problem, but they also reproduce then, and then you'll find eggs in the stool. So there is conditions where what's called overwintering, where they become very dormant in the winter, like from November through March, because the conditions are wrong. But also in the Southwest, we see what's called oversummering, where they will burrow in and hibernate, especially in late spring and early summer, because the conditions are wrong for their survival. So, and in the Southwest, we actually see both of these scenarios where they were both overwinter and oversummer. And so it's really important to understand that these parasites really don't do much. They're pretty dormant until 2 to 3 weeks after it starts to rain. So when is our rainy periods? Generally speaking, in our part of the world, it's more monsoonal type rains that occur, July, August, September. So about 3 to 4 weeks after it starts to rain, that's when you see most of the larvae migrating out of the ground and being up on the grass that's growing. And so generally speaking, in a general sense, in the summertime, in the middle of summer, from June and that period of time, we don't see much parasites being migrating up out of the ground. And so because the soil moisture isn't correct for them to do so. So we have that's important for us to understand that, because if we deworm them in, say, late May or something like that, or into June, we're not going to do very good unless we use very particular types of wormers. So it's important to know. I just touch on lungworms here just because lungworms, they're not in the intestinal tract, obviously, they're in the lungs. And we see some on occasion. And because of that, it looks just like a pneumonia, because obviously it's damaging the lung, and it's generally cattle that have not been exposed to it. So it's seen a little more frequently if we bring in cattle from especially like the Southeast or the Midwest. Then we have an opportunity to introduce lungworms into a pasture or into a situation with unexposed cattle. And when cattle haven't been exposed to it before, or what are considered naive, they can become pretty highly infected with lungworms. And it results in a condition just like it looks almost like a shipping fever. And so that's something that just to remember that can occur. The thing about worms is they do cause damage. They damage the stomach, they damage the intestinal tract, but because of that, the immune system of an animal does become somewhat involved, and it tries to fight some of those worms off. So our calves and our young cattle generally are more susceptible to being wormy than our older cattle, but even adult cattle can become even clinically infected with worms because of conditions where, even though they have some immunity, maybe their nutrition is not right, or they have a mineral deficiency or a vitamin deficiency, or their protein level is too low to where their immune system is affected, and then they can also have a worm infestation that results in clinical signs. So it is really important to understand that the immune system plays a pretty significant role in the ability of livestock to fight these parasites off. And so when we do things that improve our immune system, it helps even in situations like this with parasitism. It's really important to understand that to fight this off, that nutrition is really important. If they're on a good nutritional plane, generally it's pretty difficult for them to get heavily parasitized because they're, excuse me, because of their immune system is much more robust when nutrition is good. So, and especially with that brown stomach worm, it's really important. The immune system is heavily involved in helping us control the brown stomach worm. And so it's one of those situations that we do have to, if there's a lot of parasites or a lot of worms that have larvae that have migrating out of the soil, if you have a pasture that's pretty heavily contaminated, they can also pick up a heavy enough worm burden that it overwhelms the immune system as well. So generally speaking, for cattle in the arid conditions that we deal with, if they become fairly wormy, it's either because nutrition is wrong and their immune system is compromised, or they picked up too big of a worm burden. Those are generally the two reasons that parasitism occurs. So what do you see when cattle are wormy? When we're talking about clinical cases of being wormy, we see cattle that have, they get pretty anemic. Those worms, they suck a lot of protein out of them, and so their nutritional status, they have rough hair coats, they become thin, they don't eat well because low protein levels will actually kind of impede the appetite. They cannot digest very well because of the inflammation and the scarring that is occurring in their intestinal tract, and they can get diarrhea. The low protein level can cause them to become pot-bellied, and then also we see it a fair amount here in the Southwest. Well, they'll get swelling underneath their throat, and it's called bottle jaw. It looks kind of like, I don't know if you all are familiar with a wooden tongue cow, but that swelling that occurs under here, like in wooden tongue cows, looks exactly the same as a bottle jaw that they can develop because they're wormy. And it can get to the point where they can become thin and weak enough that they can't get up anymore. And so do we see really heavily parasitized cattle that it actually kills them? And the answer is yes, we can see that and have seen it. It's pretty unusual, and usually it's in an immunocompromised animal. But the point is if you see some clinical signs, that tells you got a lot of cattle or sheep or goats out there that are subclinical and parasitized. They may not show you hardly any signs, but they are being affected because of the presence of the worms. So it's really important to pay attention to this, in my opinion. And this is what I suggested to all of my clients, is that for sure, I think at the very minimum, depending on situations, which we'll talk about, especially cattle, they need to be dewormed at least once a year. And I think it's that important. I think it's something that should become an annual thing that is always included without missing. So I think it's a very important part of your preventative health program. So the signs that we talked about up there in the top part of that slide, the pot belly, diarrhea, drawn up, weak, rough, dry hair coats, all that, it looks exactly the same as malnutrition. And that's pretty much the case. If you have a lot of parasites in that bowel, those cattle are suffering from malnutrition. One is that the bowel can't absorb it as well, but also those parasites suck so much nutrition right out of the and take the food, and so that's not available to the livestock. So it's really important to understand, like I mentioned before, you got to make sure that you have enough protein, your vitamin and mineral balance is good, because when that is all okay, they won't develop near as heavily of worm infestations as if those things are off. The other thing that's important to understand about internal parasites is that their damage can be severe and can be long-lasting, because especially with the brown stomach worm, it can cause scarring when they burrow into the stomach lining that results in scar formation that is there from then on. Well, that affects their digestion. They don't have the ability to digest as well because of the inflammation that's present in the stomach. So it's really important to understand that keeping cattle, and this is absolutely necessary with horses. When we talk about horses and parasitism, we know that almost all colic, and from research that's been done, the estimate is at least 85% of all cases of colic can be attributed to parasitism that occurred in the first 2 years. And so with young horses, it is absolutely critical that you very routinely deworm them and keep them worm-free, because in the end, the scarring that occurs from those parasites affects the blood supply to the bowel. And so almost all clinical colic cases are a result of either a blood clot or something like that goes down into the bowel and causes an area of the bowel to lose blood supply, which results in a case of colic. And like I said, 85% of all colic is due to the first 2 years. And so those of you with horses, and especially if you raise them, it is of the utmost importance that you get on a deworming preventative healthcare deworming program that is really, I used to tell everybody, I wanted those foals dewormed every 60 days until they were 2 years old. And because it's really critical that you keep that scarring from occurring when they're young, because after they get over 2, then their immune system is a little more capable of doing and helping you fight things off. But especially when we talk about horses, it's really important that you worm them very frequently when they're young. So the other part of this is that cattle that have never been exposed to worms, that come in from a different part of the country and haven't been exposed to, say, maybe brown stomach worms, have other parasites. Those are the ones that become pretty heavily worm burdened, those that have immune challenges. But like I said, most of them, the infections are things you can't see. And it results in decreased protein absorption. The immune system becomes depressed. I'm going to make one point on this here in a minute about that immune system thing that's unbelievably important. But also you'll have decreased weight gains. They become more susceptible to disease. You get more sickness and more death. And may not get as good of response to vaccines when you have it. And this is why one of the things that's been shown in research that there are excuse me, there are intestinal parasites infections that cause shifts in populations of the immune cells. And part of the population of the immune system is a particular cell line that's called T lymphocytes. And those cells are extremely important when it comes to viral infections. And what happens, because the parasites in the bowel, because they are so constant and so immunoresponsive, excuse me again, that the bone marrow begins to shift away and produce more antibodies against them, and the immune response becomes more bloodborne. And so they have less of a response when it comes to either viral infections or the ability to respond to a viral vaccine. Excuse me, just a second. Sorry about that. But that's a big part of parasites that people don't realize, that they really have a profound effect on the immune system. And as we're learning, how they cause this change in the immune response can really set them up for things like shipping fever and stuff like this as they get a little bit older. And it's because the T lymphocytes are so important on that. They also have found that because of that shift in the immune system, that this can have a negative effect on the performance throughout the feeding period all the way to the harvest plant. So what happens in these calves early can have a profound effect all the way through the feeding period. So when we talk about deworming strategies, one of the things that we got to remember is that we're trying to do things based upon the biology of the parasite. And that means that the timing needs to be correct. And so what we're trying to do is expose the parasite to a drug at the right particular time to help break the life cycle. So the correct time to worm cattle is not when they're in the corral or or because we're handy and we're doing something, that's when we need to do it. From a strategic standpoint, it needs to be the correct time, which is when the parasite is beginning to develop and cause damage and the conditions are best for the transmission. When they begin to reproduce, that's really when we want to deworm. And that's the ideal time to deworm. So if we do that at the right time, it breaks the life cycle, and then they don't build up near the number that they can because of that. So it depends on it. So the right time to worm cattle or livestock of any kind, it depends on both the parasite and when the conditions, the environmental conditions are optimal, which generally translates to the more moderate temperatures, rainfall, and wet grass. So when we hit the monsoonal season, for about that first 3 to 4 weeks, that would be the ideal time to deworm, because that's when the numbers can be quite high in those cattle. The problem is in our country and in yours, we have big pastures with low stocking density, and we don't work cattle then. And one of the hardest things for us to do is the gather. So when we have to go out there and gather, we got to do everything we can. And so, unfortunately, in our world, it would be nice to do it optimal, but that's not really what fits our management out here in this arid country in the Southwest. So what we have to do is do the best we can when we have them in. And to me, that's why I put that second statement in there. That's why your product choice is so important, because it is of the utmost importance that you choose your products carefully. Because if we're going to do the best we can, then we've got to use the best products. And I can tell you for sure, one of the things that we have a tendency to do is look for something that's inexpensive, which generally speaking does not mean the best. But if we want to get the most bang for our buck, we need to do the best we can. So I'm going to just touch on external parasites, because obviously I understand that they're important, but most people understand what we need to do with that. If you're going to do something for horn flies, there's all kinds of products: back pores, sprays, dust bag, and ear tags. The strategies that probably work the best in our world are dust bags and ear tags. And it's really important that you get help trying to pick your insecticide ear tags, because which compounds you use makes a difference. And so people will say, I put a fly tag on them and they only work for 30 days. Well, that's generally because you've got a population of flies that may be resistant to that particular drug, and it doesn't kill them very good. And so it's really important that you rotate your ear tags between different classes of ear tags. So talk with your veterinarian and get some help. The university New Mexico State has a fly lab down there, and Dr. Brandon Smythe, he tests all these different drugs for a lot of pharmaceutical companies, and he maintains a population of flies that are resistant to a variety of products that kill flies. And so what he does is he tests products to see if you've got a permethrin-resistant fly, what's the best thing to kill them? What other product do you use to do that? So if you have questions, folks at the university can generally help you when it comes to, especially to horn flies, because we've got that fly lab down there, and they've been doing research for many, many years and looking at what products work the best. But Brandon is great. He's really good and helpful. And he's very, very knowledgeable. So if you have fly questions, you can get with me or somebody, even your county agent or somebody associated with the university can help you get in touch with Dr. Smythe to get your fly tag and fly product questions answered. So when it comes to grubs, obviously there's back pores, sprays, dust bags. The ivermectin type drugs work really well to kill grubs. If you say the name ivermectin, some of the grubs will start to die. I mean, it kills the heck out of grubs. Timing is important with that, because especially if you use an that's what the OP there stands for, organophosphate. If you use organophosphate back pores, you have to be concerned about that, because there is the heel fly, when it bites especially cattle, when it bites the cow, it's usually around the feet. and then it migrates through the body up to the back, and then it'll erupt out of the back and as a grub, and it will transform into an adult heel fly. But when they're migrating, they will go through the pharyngeal area, and they can cause bloating that occurs and can actually cause some deaths if you kill grubs when there's a bunch of larvae in the pharyngeal area. So that's not a concern with the ivermectin type products, but it is a concern if you use sprays or pores that are organophosphates. So just keep that in mind. When it comes to ticks and lice, generally most things work pretty good. The back pores, sprays, dust bags, the ivermectins work really, really well. There is some timing issues. And so generally speaking, when we have the cattle in, we can do a pretty good job of killing off all the ticks. But we've got to be a little bit careful about the lice, because lice have a tendency to become more active really late in the late winter and early spring. That's why you see all the cattle coming up about now rubbing the hair off their shoulders and stuff. Is generally because of lice. And so you got to use a product that has a little bit longer action, so to speak, to kill most of your lice. And so that's something that you need to consider if external parasites are a problem, which in our world they generally are. We have some grub problems in places where we're really careful in deworming cattle every fall using an ivermectin. We have very little grub problems because we've killed off most of the horn flies. And generally, we don't have very, very severe tick or lice problems. Our lice especially, we have ticks all the time. But lice generally aren't terrible bad if we're doing something every year. And we can usually keep lice kind of beat down a little bit. I'm putting this slide up here because I want you to look over here on the left-hand side of the slide. It talks about a lot of different products, and it has trade names. This is important. The reason I put this slide up there, if you look at those names, like, can you see? Hopefully you can see my arrow here. Tramasol, Levosol, or Tramasol. That's the names for it. Fenbendazole, Safeguard, or Panicure. The thing that's important about this is these are name brand products. These are the products that you want to use. You do not want to use generic wormers. And I'll tell you that straight out. You're wasting your money and you're doing a bad thing, because these generic wormers create or contribute to parasite resistance. So it's of the utmost importance that you use name brand products when it comes to dewormers. In parasites, it's probably one of the most important things you can do is to make sure you use a product that gets you a good kill. And unfortunately, a lot of our generic products, even though the compound, the active compound is the same, there are other things that are not, and they have a tendency to not perform at the same level at which our name brand products do. We don't get the same rate of kill. So that's really important. So when we talked at the opening, what's the reason that,
John,
why do everybody, yes.
John, this is Marge. I had a question on your previous slide. Can we go back to your previous slide? Okay. Yep. Those on the far right, left-hand side,
yes.
The Dectomex, the Ivomec, Eframex, Sected, the one that CYDEN, those are very familiar. Okay, so are they, you're telling me they're generic? Or
no, these are all name brand products here. I wanted to show you those names so that you recognize them. So Safeguard and Panicure is name brand. Synanthic is a name brand. Valbazin is a name brand. Cydectin is a name brand. Eprinex is name brand. Dectomax, Ivomec, Ivomec Plus, and Curatrim. These are all name brand products. These are the ones you want to use.
Okay. All right. Yeah, we do use those and we do alternate it. So I was just wondering why they were in brackets and the rest, there's a word right above them. Thank you, John. Dr. Wenzel.
This is the chemical name of the product. So this is the chemical name. This is the trade name right here. Those that are in the parentheses, that's what you'll see on the shelf. This is actually the compound that's inside it. So like Valbazin, its compound is albindazole. Or like Ivomec, its main product is ivermectin. So that's what this is. This is the compound name and this is the trade name. And I want you to sure recognize those names. That's really important, especially with wormers, that we only use the things that are name brand products.
Hi, John. I had a question about that again. Is that the same thing as the active ingredient?
Yes. Yes. So this is so this compound. This is the active ingredient in these wormers. Like for instance, when you ivermectin is the active ingredient in Ivomec. Now there will be other products that have as the active ingredient they will have Ivomec, but they are considered generic wormers. And the reason is that the name brand product, Ivomec, when it was developed, received a patent. That patent allows them an opportunity to sell their product for a period of time to recover their research and development costs and stuff like that before the active ingredient can be introduced to the marketplace. So you hear that all the time about the patent is off. A good example of that is the patent is now off of Draxxin. So now there's going to be all kinds of generic Draxxins flooding the marketplace. The problem with it is, and I have actually had generic companies call me and start raising Cain with me, but they can't argue. Ivomec itself, the active ingredient is only one part of that's been researched. So for instance, with Ivomec and Dectomax, they both have a stabilizing molecule that was developed during the research project. In fact, it was the same guy that developed the stabilizing molecule for Ivomec, went to work for Pfizer and developed the stabilizing molecule for Dectomax. And the stabilizing molecule, if you remember, you look at Ivomec, it has a very, very long shelf life. The reason is that molecule stabilizes it. So when a drug comes off of patent, the only thing that's released to the marketplace is the active ingredient. So the stabilizing molecule remains proprietary. That's not released with the active ingredient. That remains the property of the developing company. So obviously these companies, when they make, say, generic ivermectin, they try to go back and reverse engineer and figure out what that stabilizing molecule is. And to some extent, some of them can figure that out. But the whole thing is that even the bottle of Ivomec, you may not realize that Ivomec bottle has been patented. That's not released because it's a 3-layer product. That bottle actually has 3 layers in it. And because of that, the bottle contributes to the stability of the product that's inside. So it's really important to understand that, yes, we see the same active ingredient, but there's a lot more things that go into it. And that's been a problem because there was a project done at Kansas State University several years ago, quite a few years ago now, where they compared 14 different generic products to the name brand product. And only the name brand product had 100% of the active ingredient because the generics had less. And also the purity of the compounds that they use in certain situations may not be as pure, which affects its ability to work. Okay, does everybody understand that concept? That's a really important concept. So those are really good questions. Okay, I'm going to move on.
I have a quick question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Out of those brands, I mean, I've used all of them, but which one would you recommend to be your top brand? Because I was once told that you should be switching it because the parasites start to get immune to those if you use the same antibiotic. I mean, the Poron or whatever.
Same wormer. Yes, and that does contribute. Now we see less of it in cattle. So in cattle, I'm pretty comfortable. The only 2 products that I really like to use in cattle are Ivomec and Dectomax. That's about the only 2 that I use. And when we were able to get Ivomec, I used Ivomec for every year in some of my herds for 20, 25 years. We really never saw much of a resistance problem, because what we did do is make sure we got a good kill off right off the bat. Now, and especially in our arid conditions, if we were in the Midwest where it rained all the time, that would be much more of a problem for us to use one product. And rotation becomes much, much more important for us. What matters in our part of the world is that you use something that really kills the heck out of them well. And of course, to me, I believe that is Ivomec or Dectomax are the only two. So in the fall, and this is a personal opinion, I always inject in the fall if I can, because I am much less of a fan of the porons in the fall, because generally speaking, we can deal with external parasites. There's lots of ways to do it. And even the injectables are pretty good and all that. But the thing of it is that, and I know for a fact, because I've talked with veterinarians that work in feed yards and in harvest plants that have told me that cattle coming out of poron programs have more worms than cattle that come out of injection programs. So they prefer, when we're talking about internal parasites, the stomach worms and stuff like that, the injection does a better job of killing them than does the poron. So if I'm deworming in the fall, and we'll talk a little bit about the timing of it, I want to inject them with the best product I can get my hands on. That's my strategy. Because generally speaking, and we'll talk about that when we get to cattle, I generally only worm them once.
I have one more question.
Sure. Go ahead. Did we lose you?
Long range. I have a question about long range. I
Yes.
just didn't notice that on your chart. What's your?
Well, it's because my slide's a little bit old. But
okay. So how is long range fall in this?
So long range is a great product in certain situations. I think if I was in the Midwest and places where it rains more, I think long range is terrific. It's what's called a biphasic wormer. It has two cycles where it kills, because it has the formulation has been adapted to where you have one form of the drug Ivomec that's in there that kills the worms pretty quickly, like a normal Ivomec injection, but it also has a sustained release capability, so that it has down the road, it also releases another dose of wormer, so to speak. So basically, when you use long range, it's almost like giving them two different doses about three to 4 months apart. It really, I think, if I remember right, I think it gives you a pretty good sustained action for about 150 days of keeping them worm free. Now, in our part of the world, we generally don't have those kinds of worm burdens where that's necessary. But I do some help. I help the guy, one of my ranches buys bulls from a guy in central Texas, where it's much, the humidity's higher. It's, it rains more and all that kind of stuff. And when we put him on long range, he said his cattle have never done so well, because he had such a worm burden in his pastures that by doing that biphasic type worming, it worked extremely good for him. So long range is a great option if you're in the conditions where you feel like you need that extra protection. And of course, it's quite a bit more expensive than most of the other options, but it's a great product and should be on this list, because long range is a name brand product. Okay, so back to what we were talking about. Most of the reason we deworm is to improve our economic return. That's really what it's about. So this is just to show you a little bit about some differences in cattle that were dewormed strategically, or versus cattle that were not. They were controlled. And so when they went, they had these cattle in this project. This was in, if I remember right, this was in Oklahoma, which obviously they have more parasite problems than we do. But they found about 48 pounds difference in cattle that were wormed versus the controls that were not dewormed. So when they went into the feed yard, the fecal egg counts, or the worm eggs that were present, this is eggs per gram, in cattle that have been dewormed, their egg counts were much, much lower than our controls. This is the important part of it. The cattle that were put in the feed yard that had to be pulled to be treated for disease, 83% of those of all the feedlot pulls were from cattle that were not dewormed. They were the pasture controls. So also in 4 out of the 5 deads, that means 80% of those in the dead pile were from the pasture controls as well. So that gives you an example or an idea how important this is from a disease resistance standpoint, how important deworming can be. And so also, where'd my arrow go? 26% improvement in choice of the cattle that were dewormed versus the controls. So the cattle that were wormed, 26% more of them graded choice over the controls. And that all has to do with this average daily gain increase. So, it really can be a pretty economically rewarding process for you. So when we looked at this, and I've been harping about name brand stuff. And so this is a look at generic wormers. In this particular research project, they split cattle and they treated them several different ways, put them on the same pasture, and just looked at average daily gains. So they had a control group, which was 1.3 pounds per day. Those that they dewormed with a generic ivermectin here and here, and they were actually less than what the controls were. This is a generic wormer. When you look at the name brand, the average daily gain on the cattle with the name brand product, the Ivomec Poron, was 1.42 pounds per day gain, which meant that there was 22 pounds of additional gain. In this particular one, they used Dectomax compared to generic ivermectin. And Dectomax, there was 22 pounds of additional gain. So if the value, this is just a simple math. If the value of the gain was 70 cents a pound, 22 pounds was worth 15 bucks. So if they gave you the dewormer, they would also have to give you $15 to get the same economic return that you did just by using Dectomax. The point is the generics are not the same, and they don't perform as well. And so there's a reason why they're that much cheaper. But in my opinion, I believe that you get a much better return on your investment by using name brand products that offsets the savings that you use to buy generic wormers. So if you don't take anything else home tonight, take that home. Spend the money and get the good stuff. This is another deal where they looked at a generic ivermectin and Dectomax Poron. I mean, there's significant difference in pounds here. Day 0, day 30, day 60, at a day 162. If you look at this, they were 20, 23, 24 pounds heavier than the cattle that were dewormed with a generic product. That's my point. It's not worth the money you spend on it. So we're going to talk specifically about just deworm to close things up here. And realize this is my opinion. You need to talk with your veterinarian to get some ideas. And I think there's lots of different ways to skin the cat. But for sure, with range horses that are out on pasture all the time, I really prefer to deworm them at least twice a year with an ivermectin type wormer in the fall after frost so that it kills the bot flies. So if you deworm in the fall of the year, say October, November, probably October up in your parts, you probably have had a pretty good frost or killing frost that kills most of the flies. Then you want to use these are the name brand products, Ecvalens, Imectrin, Quest, and I know there's others. These are ones that I've used and in my hands work well. There are some other name brand products, but the main thing is it needs to be name brand. And then, so if you do that in the fall in just straight pasture horses, then your white wormers can be used in the spring. White wormers being other brands like they're called benzimidazoles, lots of different products. The thing of it is that it's true with horses. Horses that are in a corral are way different creatures. Horses out in pasture, they're not exposed to the same worm burdens. It's kind of like all the other livestock that we've talked about. It becomes much more of a problem for them in late summer, early fall, that they get the worm burdens that you normally see. So if you clean them out in the fall, they do pretty good until in the spring when there's some some early green up and stuff like that, there's more parasites in the ground, especially with our horses, it seems like, that it's easier for horses to pick it up the way they eat and stuff. And so they'll end up getting infested. So with those, I do think it's worthwhile to deworm them, say, in kind of spring, kind of late spring in that May, June area. I think it's a good idea to deworm them horses. But I like to alternate. So I use ivermectin in the fall and then use one of the other products, Panicure, Fenbendazole, Panicure Safeguard, something like that. If you have a lot of horses, you need to, if you look into it a little bit, I know I used to have all my people buy the cattle wormer because if it had horse on it, it was more expensive. And you could buy the paste cattle wormer using a big cocking gun and worm horses a lot cheaper than you could if you bought the horse wormer. And so you got to do some work with the dosage, to make sure you're giving the adequate dose. Horses that are in a corral are a whole different deal, because it only takes about 6 to 8 weeks before a horse that you clean out with worms, and if they're in a dry lot corral where they're picking every alfalfa leaf off the ground and they're in there crapping, they're releasing all those larvae into the corral. So when they're going around trying to pick up alfalfa leaves, they end up picking up worm larvae as well. And so it only takes 6 to 8 weeks for them to become wormy. So if you figure that, you need to worm them horses about 4 times a year. You need to do it about every 3 months because it takes 6 to 8 weeks for them to become wormy and those worms to start reproducing. So if you worm them every 3 months, and you want to rotate your wormers, but make sure you always use an ivermectin in the fall after a hard frost to kill the bot flies. If the bot flies are dead, then when you use an ivermectin, it'll kill the heck out of those bots that are in the horse's stomach. But like I told you before, now this is different. What you want to do is, especially if you've got foals, you want to worm them every 60 to 90 days until they're 2 years old. Because what you do with those baby horses makes a great difference when they become older. It's really important to do that. When we talk about deworming cattle, generally speaking, in our arid country, I think it's okay to worm 1 time a year because generally speaking, our worm burden only occurs from about September, October. July, if it rains like it's supposed to, the 4th of July, you're looking at the end of July before you start picking up worms. So you're talking August, September, and maybe October is really about the only time they're going to be exposed to very many worm larvae. I mean, it can happen throughout the year, but we're talking about the number of larvae that will create a real problem for us. And so that occurs in real late July, August, and September. So if you're working cattle, which is when we preg these cows, is in September, October, November, December, basically, if you worm once, you're going to do a pretty good job of cleaning them out. Because after, the weather starts to cool off and it starts to dry up again in that September time frame, the worms, they kind of go back into the soil and don't come out again. So in cattle, you want to use an ivermectin, which in my opinion, this is only my opinion, I think Ivomec or Dectomax are the only 2 things that I would use. And I really prefer the injection, doing it in the fall. And so you do that a cc per 110 pounds sub-Q. And remember, there's a 35 to 42 day withdrawal associated with using that. So be cautious of that. Now, if you've got cattle that say go up to high meadows in the summertime or something like that, it may be that you might want to do a summer deworming. You can use a pour-on is okay. Or use a white wormer, a drench type wormer, Panicure, Safeguard, Albindazole, anything like that. It's nice to be able to rotate. But the idea is that you'd like to clean those cattle out before they go to those summer pastures. Because in the summer pastures, generally is when the conditions become more right for worms to reproduce and stuff. And so by cleaning them out before they go up there, you're going to reduce the parasite burden that's released into your meadows. So if you have that, if you do that type of grazing schemes, it's a really good idea to clean the livestock, and we're talking sheep, goats, whatever you want to talk about. Do it before you go up into those summer pastures so that you keep your summer pasture a little more cleaned up. If you're on an irrigated pasture, if you have pivots or something like that, then it's also a little bit different. You probably would benefit from deworming those cattle in the summer, and you can use a drench wormer. It's fine. They're less expensive, and they do a good job of killing the internals. And especially like your Safeguard and Panacure, that's two names for the same product. And then Valbazin is a little different. This is Albindazole. These are fenbendazoles. But if you use these two products and this one, they actually kill worm larvae that are encysted. So it's really important. So those drenches are really good. Only those fenbendazoles that you can use to kill those encysted larvae, or an ivermectin type pour-on, are about the only things you want to use in the summer. And like I said, but with cattle, it's really important that we do the best job in the fall, because that's going to be when we out the best is in the fall. And the nice thing about using Ivomec or Dectomax, you're also going to kill off most of the lice and ticks as well. Be aware that these products don't work great on ear ticks. Ear ticks are a different creature. The last couple of years, we've had a little bit more trouble with ear ticks. Generally speaking, I recommend that you treat ear ticks individually if you're having a problem. If you're on an irrigated pasture, like I said, you can use a drench that works really well, and you get rid of those, and then come in and use your ivermectin in the fall. So sheep.
Dr. Wenzel?
Yes,
this
go
is
ahead.
Marge. I have a question back to the previous slide. Would the 4-H steer fall in the pasture category?
No, generally generally speaking, okay. Because your show cattle are fed everything they get, so they're generally in a dry lot situation. So we don't have near as many worm burdens with our show calves as we do pasture cattle or other types of cattle, because everything they get is fed to them. And so unless you got several of them in the same corral where they're all eating and crapping, crapping where they eat, why then you might pick up some more worm birds. But it's really important with your show cattle, and this is true for show lambs and show goats. You want to make sure you clean them out really good as soon as you get them home. So as soon as you get your group put together, you worm them all and you clean them out and you keep them cleaned out. So generally speaking, I still like an ivermectin type. I don't like to inject our show calves much. And people say, well, if you use a pour-on, that it can be hard on the hair. Now, I have not experienced that. I had my show folks use it, and I never did see any problems with the hair when we used to pour on. But the drenches work really well. I like to use an ivermectin type at least once. And then after that, I'm going to go for your drenches. But just remember, they all have withdrawals associated with them. So it's something that you got to pay attention to. I should have put the withdrawals in. I did on sheep and goats, and I didn't think about doing it on the cattle. But just read the labels and make sure you observe those withdrawals. Okay? Did that answer your question, Marjorie?
Yes,
yep. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So when we talk about worm and sheep, we're in a little different deal too. So with pasture, you need to deworm the same thing as cattle, kind of mid to late fall, using an Ivomec drench. And I put dosages and withdrawals on this so that you're aware. So for instance, with the Ivomec drench, you're going to give 12 cc's per 100 pounds, and it has an 11-day withdrawal. This was from Dr. Zimmerman, and he told me that, and I talked to him because he's a small ruminant guru. Our state veterinarian is really sharp when it comes to small ruminants. He was telling me that there's been some research that showed the Ivomec injection given at 1 cc per 75 pounds squirted in their mouth. That's important. You give it orally, has been shown to kill them really fast, that there's been less resistance developed. So that's an important point to file away. If we have worms that the population is becoming a little more resistant, maybe way this may be a way to help battle that a little bit, is use the injectable at 1 cc per 75 pounds and squirt it in their mouth. There's also the Sidectin, which is moxidectin, at 9.2 cc's per 100 pounds as a 14-day withdrawal. And the thing about moxidectin is it's shown to be able to kill some resistant homuncus, which is one type of a worm that's pretty serious. And if you have a population of homuncus that's resistant to other wormers, then Sidectin drench can be helpful to battle that. So you can also use the fenbendazoles like we've talked about. That's Panicure and Safeguard. You got to remember that fenbendazole cannot be used in sheep. It is not labeled for sheep. If you use it in sheep, it is extra label drug use, and you got to visit with your veterinarian before you can do that. But fenbendazole is a really good wormer because it's really good about killing encysted larvae. And that dosage is 2.5 cc's per 100. And it has a 6-day withdrawal. And then there's albindazole, which is a drug called valbazin. It's dosed at 3 cc's, and it is labeled for sheep. And I like using those in the spring and summer, especially. But if I'm going to be deworming sheep, pasture sheep especially, in the fall, I want to use the ivermectin-based type products. One of the things that they have shown is that in one paper with some folks coming out of the University of Georgia, they found that Dectomax, let me see if I remember right. Yeah, Dectomax, I believe, hasn't been as effective given in the injectable form to sheep. And so they kind of felt like you should stay away from it. No, the ivermectins, yeah. In sheep, they felt like you should stay away from injecting the cattle injection with sheep, that you're better off using the drench when it comes to the ivermectins. So that's just something to be aware of as well. I will make the point out that, it's really good, just like I talked about with the others, is that worming with a white wormer before you go out in your spring and summer pastures is really good. But you got to remember, with valbazin, with sheep and goats, you don't want to use it within 30 days of conception, which shouldn't be a problem because most of the time we're breeding our, turning the bucks in and say, I don't know, whatever it is, September or something like that. So it's usually not a problem. But just be aware that valbazin can cause some problems with early pregnancies. So keep that in mind. So deworming goats. Goats are almost as much of a problem, or more so maybe even than sheep, with resistant population worms. In both sheep and goats, resistance to products is really a problem for us. And so you really make sure you use the name brand stuff in them for sure. So it's the same with pasture goats. You do it the same thing. You deworm mid to late fall using an ivermectin drench or something like that. But if you'll notice, the dosages for goats is double what it is for sheep. And so for the ivermectin drench, it was 12 cc's per 100 for sheep, but in goats, you double that dose, which increases your withdrawal time. It's 16 days of meat, 9-day milk if you're milking the goats. Given the ivermectin injection orally has been shown to kill faster, just like it does in sheep, and moxidectin, but you also have to double the dose on moxidectin. You also double the cattle dose in goats for the white worms as well. So it does change withdrawal times, as you can see here on the slide. So if you're using, this is another point that Dr. Zimmerman told me, if you're consuming the milk from the goats, you can use Pyrantel. It's a wormer called Pyrantel pamoate. There's quite a few of them out there at 25 milligrams per kilogram. And depending on whose you buy, the concentration can be different. So I just gave you an example here. If it's 50 milligrams per ml, you give 20 cc's per 100 pounds. And if you do that, squirt it in their mouth, there is no milk withdrawal. So if you're milking your goats and consuming it, you may want to consider worming your goats with a Pyrantel product, doing it and doing it orally, of course, because then it doesn't affect the milk. Okay. So In summary, external parasites, deal with them. You know, we know that they decrease and lower immune response. We understand that. If you have a problem with them, most of the time, a lot of your products will help you deal with those, but pay attention to it. Internal parasites are what really cause the most injury, and it can be long-term, including all the way through the feeding finish. And we do know that if you treat parasitized cattle, it increases revenue, increases cattle health and well-being, and that's what it's all about. Name brand products perform more predictably than generics, and generics may contribute to resistance more than name brand products because they don't kill quite as well as the name brand products do. So that's the take-home messages. Pay attention, talk with your veterinarian, figure out a good deworming strategy that works for you. And remember, like I said, from a strategic standpoint, it's really hard for us to deworm when we need to. So what we want to do is the best we can when we have the cattle or when we have the livestock in. And that means using the best products that we can. So, okay, I'm going to open it up for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Wenzel. And we want to open up for questions. So please, if you guys have any questions out there, feel free to put them in the chat box, or you can go ahead and unmute yourselves.
I have a question.
Okay.
So, boy, I just lost my train of thought. I forget what question I was even going to ask you. Maybe I'll come back to you. Sorry.
Well, when it does, just make sure you ask it, okay?
Dr. Wenzel, I
Yes.
have a question back to the cattle pour-on. There's a pour-on that just recently came out. It's, if I can pronounce it, Efrizero. It's spelled EPRIZERO.
Do you know who makes it?
I think it's the same as Eframex.
Okay, Eprinex. Okay.
But
I'm not familiar with that product.
I ended up buying one last year, and then it wasn't cheap at all too. So I just thought, well, something new, and I just looked up my cattle record, and I had to make sure I spelled it right. Yeah, it's EPRIZERO. I think it's an Ivomec or something like that. So I just had a question.
It's probably related. It's probably in the eprinomectin class, just like Eprinex is. And so it's you know, what they do is with all these different, there are really some pretty profound differences in all the different ivermectins that are out there. Like Ivomec, its compound is, you know, they change something to make Decamax or Doramectin. They change something to make epimectin. The molecules are not the same, and therefore they have different killing patterns. They'll change the molecule some way, and so it may have more activity against certain parasites than others. And so when you look at all these different ivermectins, especially when you look at the profile of how they kill some worms better than others, and this other product will kill some other worm better than the other. They're all good. But what concerns me a little bit is, like, if you look at, for instance, there's a generic called Doramectin, and, you know, or Duravet, you know, these types of products, they're generics, and but they try to do something similar to the name. So Ep0, is, as long as it's made by the same company as Eprinex is, then it's probably a pretty good product. But there probably is a difference in it of some kind. And so, especially if it was expensive, it makes you think that it's probably more of they probably changed that, the epinephrine molecule a little bit different. they change something on it, and it's probably not the same compound. So, but the thing of it is that those different formulations of, say, epinephrine and all that, they're not a lot different than the name brand, than the novel or the primary drug. And so you would expect the activity to be pretty similar to Epinex. If you want to change, then you may want to change into a Dectomax or an Ivomec, because those molecules have enough difference to them. That you may get a little better activity out of the deal. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
And then another thing was we usually have issues with cattle ear ticks.
Yes.
And so we started using the insecticide tag.
Yes.
Like we had used Patron and
Patriots,
Warriors. Yeah. And we're really doing good with that. And we probably just find that one trying to survive. So that was very helpful for our herd, that we had to apply the insecticide tags to our cattle. So, and then they have different names as well. Yes, we do see some generic ones as well, but we try to stay away from it. Just like you said, there's more larger return in using the brand name. So, well, your presentation was very good, Dr. Wenzel. We really appreciate it, and thank you so much.
You bet.
So I thought of the question now that I wanted to ask you.
Okay.
So sometimes, I guess in the past, I raise goats, and in the past I have kind of resorted to whatever I could find at my local ag store. So for the drenches, for the goats, like the Ivomec drench, does it have to be specifically for goats, or could it be a sheep drench?
No, it's sheep and goats is the same.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so it's there's no real difference in the formulations between those. So sheep and goat, most of them, the labeling is really strange. Like there's some labels, for instance, like I said, with the Panicure, which is fenbendazole, which has been used for years, it's not labeled for sheep, but it's labeled for goats. Now you use them all the same, but they just spent the money. They just spent the money to get a label for goats. And so the biggest thing is that from an extra label drug use standpoint, this is where this becomes important. Like using Panicure, if it doesn't say sheep on the label, or if it doesn't say goat on the label, then that means if you use it in a goat, that's extra label. And the law is such now that you better have a valid VCPR, something that your veterinarian will document. That's why you need to talk to them, because to use that off label and say in a minor species, because there's not a lot of stuff labeled for a goat. And so most everything that you do is extra label. So you need to make sure you have a VCPR with a veterinary client-patient relationship formed with your veterinarian, because if, for instance, if one of your goats ever popped a residue for some reason, if you don't have a valid VCPR, they'll really get after you. And so, and the only reason I'm telling you that is that because the laws have changed so much recently, especially with extra label drug use, it's really important that when you use stuff for goats, especially when it comes to antibiotics, it's really important that you visit with your veterinarian about it, so you have at least that conversation to say, I'm going to have to use this off label, and what do you recommend, so that they can recommend it, and you're working under the supervision of a veterinarian. And so when it comes to wormers, like you said, you don't have a lot of choices. It's a pretty tough deal. And but I am pretty sold on using things like I know for years I used 2 wormers in all of our show lambs, and I had a little flock of ewes that I used to raise show lambs with for a while and stuff like that. And I only used 2 wormers in them. I used the Ivomec drench, and I used the Albindazole. Those are the only 2 products that I used, and I used it for years and got along what I felt like was really, really well, even in all my ewes and everything else. And so I think it's it's if you use good wormers, you'll get along just fine with them.
Okay. So typically everything you shared is very enlightening. I learned a lot tonight, so thank you for that. But in the past, I had always, kind of like what you said, for convenience sake, I would worm my goats in the spring when I'm giving vaccines and ear tagging them and that kind of stuff. Last year, I had some troubles, towards late summer, early fall. The goats weren't looking good, weren't gaining weight, they were losing weight. And so I did go in and reworm some of the goats, but then I still ended up losing quite a few. So was it by the time I went in and wormed them, were they already so far gone that the wormer did no good, or?
No, I mean, wormers are worked pretty good. I mean, generally speaking, if it was clinical parasitism causing the problem, worming them, if you used like Ivermectin sheep drench.
It was Safeguard, I think. Safeguard.
Safeguard
goat drench is what I used.
Okay, Safeguard is a really good wormer, and it's good enough that it kills larvae, even the encysted stages of larvae. So far as using the Safeguard, it did what it's supposed to. I can say that pretty confidently. So you had something else on. There had to be something else that wasn't quite right.
Okay.
And so, and it may be that you might have to be, because your lot or whatever is a little more infested, that you may have to go to worming 2 times a year. And if you do that, like I said, I really believe in doing that ivermectin type, whether it be ivermectin sheep drench, whatever you might do, using ivermectin in the fall. But the other thing is make sure you look at that, because on your goats, you need to pretty well double the, when you're using the white wormers, you need to double the dose of pretty much every product that you're using. You have 2 times the dose. And that may have been, I don't know if you did that or not, but that may have contributed too. You may have been underdosing them.
Okay. So double the dose based on what's on the label.
Yes, for goats. Yeah. And so you want to make sure that, and I know it'll be on the recording. Let me go back to that particular slide real quick. With goats, so your Albindazole, that's the Safeguard is. You want to make sure you're giving 5 cc's per 100. The label states 2.5 cc's.
Okay.
And so just make sure that you have 5 cc's per 100 pound dosage, because obviously with goats we have more of a resistance problem, but also the way they sit can be more dramatic. So doubling the dose really takes care of that. So that may have been a contributor as well.
Okay. And I particularly like what you said about the milk withdrawals, because we milk our goats as well, and that's going to be very helpful, because in the past I've had troubles finding something that was even labeled for lactating goats.
Well, I don't know if it's labeled or not, but Dr. Zimmerman, who, like I said, he's a small ruminant guru. He's well known all over the nation in small ruminant medicine. He told me that yesterday, because I was talking to him about all this to make sure I'm in line with what current thinking is. And he was the one that told me about using that 25 milligrams per kilogram, put it in their mouth, and there's not a milk withdrawal with it. Okay.
Good. Hey, thank you.
You betcha.
Hey, Dr. Wenzel.
Yes.
I had a question about the parasite life cycle. How does that play into the drought? I mean, are they able to sustain and live throughout the drought long-term periods, or does that monsoon, just that one monsoon system, able to activate them and get them going, or are they?
Yes. Yeah. So basically, it doesn't matter whether there's a drought or not. What happens is they will insist, and they will stay insisted until inside the GI tract, stay insisted until both soil temperature and soil moisture reaches optimum condition. So, and that overwintering and oversummering can be pretty prolonged in drought situations. So can they survive a 2-year drought? And the answer is yes. They'll actually stay, they'll survive inside the animal. And so when it does finally rain, if you get a period where you get a couple of rains, boy, they'll go to reproducing like crazy. And that can result in higher pasture loads because they are geared towards survival, and all of a sudden the conditions are finally right. They go to passing eggs like there's no tomorrow. So yes, they will survive drought. And that's why people say, well, we're too dry to have worms. No, we're not. That really doesn't have a lot to do with it. And I worked with some drug companies to figure out it's more about the timing you check, because they would put on worming clinics and stuff like that and have people bring in fecal samples, and heck, we couldn't hardly find an egg. And, you know, in talking with some of the more knowledgeable technical services folks and all that, why they ended up, I found out that it's more about timing, and we go retest those pastures, those same places, you know, 2 weeks after it rained, and those cattle were loaded with worms. So that's why you can take samples in and you get differences in it. If you take a fecal sample in September, you're going to find worm eggs, where in August you may not have, or in July you wouldn't have.
So. Okay, thank you, Dr. Wenzel. One other question.
Sure.
The injectables, does that really play into the BQA training, I guess you could have? Because I know that I've always used Poron just because I was one less shot to the calf or cows. So
that is correct. So, but the point, and the reason I push injection in the fall is because in talking with the folks that really know, that are on the kill floor or doing necropsies late in the feed yards, are the ones that have told me that cattle coming out of a Poron only program will be more parasitized than will cattle that come out of an injectable program. So yes, we would prefer, but if we do the injection correctly, because all of the injections with the wormers are sub-Q, it should not have an effect on our beef product because we don't put any wormer in it. So as long as we're doing correct injections, it's absolutely fine to use it because it's a sub-Q injection that won't harm our product.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Wenzel. I appreciate the presentation.
You betcha.
Thank you, everyone, for those questions. Do we have any more? Any more questions you guys have?
Well, thank you all for staying with me tonight. I mean, I really enjoy this. And so I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to answer questions. I'm glad to visit with you. And hopefully we can get back to doing it face-to-face where I can enjoy it even a little more. So
yeah, well, okay.
I hope you all get rained on. So.
For sure, we're still praying for some out here. Well, we just want to go ahead and give you a big thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to do this presentation for us. And I know we kind of went over, but that's good. I'm glad that everyone's questions answered. And if you guys have any more questions, feel free to put them in a chat box, or you guys can go ahead and email either Jesse and I your questions, and we'll for sure get in contact with John to see if he can answer your questions from there. But thank you everyone for attending
the
webinar.
Again, thank you again. Thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you. We hope to pretty soon. All right, bye. Well, as everyone all right. Thank you everyone for attending tonight's webinar, and I'll go ahead and share my screen. And we do have another presentation on sheep and cattle vaccination, which is going to be happening next week on February 16th from 5:30 to 6:30. This is going to be presented by Marcy Ward, another extension livestock specialist coming from New Mexico State University. So please stay tuned, and we'll go ahead and get that information out to you guys as soon as possible. This recorded session is going to be shared with you guys too, so starting pretty soon. But thank you everyone for attending tonight's webinar. We hope that you learned a lot. We learned a lot as well. So meet us next week for another one. And I know this is going to be a pretty good session as well, covering sheep and cattle vaccines. So good night, everyone. Stay safe and good night.
Kelly, can you share the next slide? I just wanted to let everyone know that, that if you want the link for this session, the recorded video, you can go ahead and go to the next screen with our email. Sorry, I'll make this pretty quick. You can email myself, Jesse, Jim, there's my email, and I'm the field coordinator for the NSA project. Email us for a copy of the PowerPoint as well as the YouTube link. And then also all our information will be on our Facebook page. Videos will be on our YouTube channel. And then we also disperse a monthly newsletter, and then any, and all of our webinars and any type of programming we send out. So send us an email and we'll get you on the email listserv. And thank you all for attending this evening. And thank you, Mikhail, for arranging this. And thank you, Dr. Wenzel, for your presentation. I think that's it. Good night, everyone.